talking. First of all, can I ask you, when did you join the party and why did you join the party? If I have it, okay.
Yes, I joined the party just before the Second World War, primarily because of the role that I saw the party playing in Britain in the fight against unemployment and particularly the fight against fascism. And I was very impressed with what the party had done in combating Mosley at home and Hitler and Mussolini abroad, what they'd done in helping to organise the International Brigade to support Republican Spain, and by what they were doing on the home front. So they seemed to be much more active than the Labour Party was. At that time, it wasn't so much the Soviet Union that brought me into the party, although after I joined I began to read much more about the Soviet Union and in general supported what they were doing, what I understood to be happening there, but it wasn't primarily because of the Soviet Union that I joined the party.
What did it mean at that time? What did it involve, being a member of the Communist Party? How much of your time did it take up? How much emotional commitment did it require?
Well, it took up a great deal of my time, and it certainly required, whether you call it an emotional commitment, or certainly a very strong political commitment. And there was a strong sense of discipline and loyalty. The heritage, as it were, of the old Leninist position in the Bolshevik Revolution persisted in not only in the British Party, but I suppose in all other parties at that time. And so one accepted the need to do what the party decided, as it were. And it didn't mean one suspended one's own judgment completely, but there was that very strong sense that we were engaged in the class war, and the other side, and particularly the fascists, were extremely organised and extremely active, and on the side of the anti-fascists they had to display the same degree of commitment and organisation.
You say it took up a lot of your time, but what actually were you doing? Was this simply attending meetings or selling papers or leafleting?
Well, I was originally in the student movement, and then I came from a farming family, actually, and so from the beginning of the war onwards, I was actually a farm manager in Bedfordshire and continued in that job until I became a full-time worker for the party. I think it was at the end of 49, if I remember rightly. So I was engaged in managing these farms in Bedfordshire, and pretty well all my spare time was devoted to doing meetings and organising the work of the Communist Party in that period. And of course in the second part of the war, after the Soviet Union was attacked, the party was extremely active and receiving very considerable support at that time.
So you were active, probably still in the student movement, perhaps, when the war broke out?
Well, I was just in the transition, actually, when the war broke out. I just ceased to be at the university.
How much awareness was there among local branches about the dispute within the leadership about how to categorise the war?
Well, it was obvious to everybody that there must have been some dispute, because the party somersaulted, not exactly overnight, but within a period of days and weeks. And so everyone knew that this change had not come about simply by common consent without any discussion, and of course after the line was changed at the beginning of the war, Pollitt, the General Secretary, was removed from his position and went back to his trade as a boilermaker. So there was nothing secret about the fact that there was a dispute. The extent of it, of course, was a different matter. And the reaction to it, in retrospect, was interesting, because I don't remember having any great qualms myself about doing the somersault. And most people that I knew accepted the new policy without any great qualms, and I don't remember I mean, there were people who disagreed, and who will, if you manage to come across any of them, will no doubt say what their reaction was at the time. But in the circles in which I moved, it was remarkable in retrospect that we accepted it so readily. And I think part of the explanation of that, it was partly because the prestige of the Soviet Union, of Stalin, and especially of Dimitrov, who was then the secretary of the Comintern and the hero of the Reichstag trial and so on. His prestige was so great that was if Dimitrov said it, it must be right, as it were. And secondly, we had all been brought up in the Leninist tradition and Leninist opposition to imperialist war and so on. And so when it was decided that it was an imperialist war, there was no great problem about accepting that position. The fact that we had previously, of course, categorized it at the beginning as an anti-fascist war, not an imperialist war, we just, I suppose, pushed into the back of our minds. At any rate, we accepted it pretty readily. And I remember Springall coming to a meeting to report on the situation. This was after he got back to Moscow. I don't remember the precise nature of the meeting, but he had a bald head, and I remember it was perspiring. He used to perspire pretty readily. He's a big chap. And giving us this report, and I don't recall there being any great controversy about it in the meeting. It was just more or less accepted.
But Harry Pollitt was very much the figurehead of the Communist Party. He was, Dorothy Thompson was saying, in Cambridge, when she was a member, many of the Cambridge students would have a photograph of Harry Pollitt on the wall in their room. And here was this man who was the leader of the movement being humbled, being shoved out of King Street, back to work as a boilerman. Did that evince no protests, no qualms of unease?
Well, I suppose. I mean, it's very difficult to go back that number of years, more than 50 years now, and remember precisely one's feelings at the time. Obviously, there was concern about this because Pollitt had there was enormous respect for Pollitt in the British Party, no doubt about that. I think, of course, you've got to remember that Pollitt himself, after 7 weeks, recanted and publicly, although he never really believed it, publicly said that he'd been wrong and that he'd made a great error and played into the hands of the class enemy and so on. So you had, and Johnny Campbell, his partner in the crime of opposing the Comintern, did the same. So you have to bear in mind that they themselves said they were wrong, and so even if you had qualms at the first, that made it much easier later to accept, well, they're great characters, but everybody's liable to make mistakes. They made a mistake, and it's unfortunate, but there it is. So there was no great sort of movement to get Pollitt back in the General Secretaryship. As far as I can recall, it was just accepted.
Talking about Pollitt, can you tell me something about what he looked like and what his presence was?
Well, he was a stocky, open-faced, a very outgoing man, absolutely the opposite of somebody like Dutt, for example, and the personification of the Lancashire working class, you might say. A craftsman. I mean, he took great pride in his craft of boilermaker. He kept his tools, and when he was General Secretary, he still kept them and looked after them. So when he went back to his trade in, I suppose it was late 39 or early 40, he had them all ready. He had a great sense of humour. He was tough, but easy to work with. I mean, I worked with him because I was Assistant General Secretary from end of 49 to early 50 onwards for 7 years. So I worked with him for a number of years, and I had an extremely high opinion of him. I mean, there's no doubt that he was extremely honest, I wouldn't say he was a great intellectual. He was a great orator, although maybe the style of oratory that is associated with him has gone out of fashion now. I don't know that he'd go down well today, but in those days he was regarded as one of the best speakers in Britain, and he did have a sort of charismatic and magnetic effect on his audiences. So I had a very high regard for him.
And Palm Dutt, different kettle of fish.
Palm Dutt was a quite different kettle of fish, and of course if you read the proceedings, the About Turn, which I don't know, you probably have, that I think that discussion is, among other things, remarkable for the fact in which it conveys the character of the different people taking part. Dutt, the sort of Jesuitical kind of argumentative character who was accepting the line of the Comintern without question and telling everybody that not only had they got to accept it, but they got to accept it willingly. You know, he was sort of saying you've got to convince yourselves. It's no good just saying you accept it. And he was laying down the law with a vengeance and using what, in retrospect, seemed to me, very Jesuitical arguments. Pollitt making a powerful speech, more emotional than, say, Johnny Campbell, his ally in the battle, because Johnny Campbell was an extremely he had a logical cast of mind, and he reasoned, and I think he made the best speech of the whole proceedings myself. He made a really good case, and in retrospect, it's a great pity that his speech wasn't published or known about at the time, because it might have influenced a lot of people in a different direction. Then you had Gallico, who was also emotional, very anti-Dutt, and used very strong language about Dutt, because he reacted against Dutt's manoeuvring and his whole argumentation. So that discussion brought out the character of the different people very clearly to me, to someone who knew them.
I get the impression you didn't like Dutt.
Well, I always got on all right with Dutt. I never liked him in the way that I liked Pollitt, and he wasn't the sort of character that he certainly didn't go out his way to make people like. I think he was a shy man, actually, in looking back. He was more, much less outgoing than Pollitt, and he would sometimes make jokes, but you had the impression they were a bit forced. They didn't come from the nature of the man. I mean, he was no doubt, like Pollitt, he was totally dedicated to what he believed to be the right policy and so on. Unfortunately, he was much more inclined to take as gospel everything that came from Moscow.
Then in 1941 the line changed again when the Soviet Union was involved in, when Hitler turned on Moscow. And the party began to win members not by the thousands, but the tens of thousands. How did the party adjust to that?
Well, with some degree of relief, of course. I mean, the days of isolation, as it were, from the rest of the left were ended, and so there was a good deal of relief in the fact that we were now alongside a great many other people in the anti-fascist struggle. That period of opposition to the war wasn't an easy one, as you can imagine, and there was always a fear at that time the party might actually be declared illegal, especially after the Daily Worker was banned. So the period following on the Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was for the party a period of very great advance, and there were a lot of problems, organizational problems, in coping with the new members, in ensuring that they had some understanding of what they had joined and of Marxism, because a great number of them didn't join because of any understanding of Marxism. They'd joined because they saw the Red Army doing this, that and the other to Hitler, and they thought there must be something in it. And so many of them came into the party, not in any way as convinced Marxists or communists, but with a desire to find out more about this system that had enabled the Soviet Union to stand up to Hitler. That was and of course many of them also recognised what the party was doing in Britain in the anti-fascist struggle, and also, if they knew anything about its history, what it had done before the war, and they overlooked that little period when we were on the other side, as it were. So there were problems, but they were overshadowed by the great positive advances and the hopes that we had for the future for the party.
But the 45 election was a disappointment. Willie Gallagher retained his seat, Phil Prenattin won a seat, but Harry Pollitt and various others lost.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was a disappointment, because I think certainly we had hoped that Pollitt would be returned. And I think that, as you'd probably know, there was an interregnum between the voting and the final count because of counting the votes of the servicemen. And in that interregnum, my wife and I and Pollitt were on holiday together in Cornwall, and I think Harry was virtually certain that he was in, and indeed it was said afterwards that he would have been in but for the servicemen's vote. If he'd just been in on the Ronda people who were there in the Ronda at the time, it said that he would have won, because his defeat was a relatively narrow defeat. I don't know that we expected anybody else actually to get in. Maybe we did, I can't remember now. It was really the fact that Pollitt didn't get in that was a big disappointment.
How did he take that? Did it influence his attitude towards the development of the party?
Well, I mean, I think he was disappointed, but he'd been in a lot of elections and been disappointed before, and so while the fact that it was so close, in a sense, added to the sense of disappointment, as far as I can recall, he took it as part of the game. You win some, you lose some, and so on. I mean, I wasn't working with him as closely then as later. I was on the executive committee of the party, but I wasn't in day-to-day contact with him at the time, so my impression of him is simply from the discussions that took place in the executive committee and the other committees on which I might have met him at the time.
Then in 47, in his booklet Looking Ahead, he had a chapter entitled The British Road to Socialism. This was the precursor, in a sense, of the party programme.
Yes, it had in it some of the, in very broad general terms, the perspective, which later was made much more concrete in the British Road to Socialism as a programme itself. The chapter in Looking Ahead did say that there were other roads than the Soviet road to socialism, and held out the prospect of a parliamentary road. But as I say, it was in very general terms. And by the way, although some people have said, well, this showed already that the party in Britain was pursuing an independent line from the Comintern, that isn't really the case, because Stalin himself, in an interview with Morgan Phillips and the Labour Party delegation, I think it was in 1946, had said, this was all published at the time, I think, in the Daily Herald. I mean, it was Morgan Phillips' version of what Stalin had said, but I don't see any reason to doubt its validity, and certainly Stalin never denied it. But he said as early as that there was another road in Britain. He said that, I've forgotten the exact details, but you'll find them in that thing I did in changes on the British road and Stalin. He said that they'd had one road in the Soviet Union. The Labour Party was pursuing a different road to socialism in Britain. It was slower, but involved less violence, some such phrase as that. So he had already held out the prospect and the perspective of a different path. from that pursued in the Soviet Union. And after he had spoken, then Torres in France and Gottwald in Czechoslovakia and other people said similar things about their particular circumstances, and Harry in looking ahead.
Which brings us on to the question of the drafting of the British Road in 50-51. We now know, through your article, that a lot of it came from Moscow. Where did the genesis of the British Road, the new party programme, come from? Was that from Stalin, or was that from King Street?
Well, according to my note, by the way, one thing I must say, which qualifies the whole of this interview, don't rely on my memory. I cease to rely on it, especially things that happened 40 or 50 years ago. Although the memory, as you know, is a curious thing. You sometimes remember with the utmost vividness things that happened 40 years ago and forget what happened yesterday. But in general, I don't recall a lot of detail about what happened all that number of years ago, and most of what I wrote about, I wouldn't have written it, in fact, if I hadn't had notes, because I wouldn't have relied on my memory. I mean, I had a general memory of what had happened, but certainly the detail was gone, and it's only in my notes that I've been able to flesh out the process. Now, according to the notes that I made, and according to any documents that we have here, there was never any reference to a party program being produced in 1950 prior to Pollitt coming back from Moscow in that year. Of course, we had in 1935 a program called For Soviet Britain, and we'd begun to produce a new program at the outset of the war, but that project was abandoned because of the war breaking out, and so although there was a draft, it was never actually published. But I've been able to find no reference anywhere to any discussion of a long-term program prior to Pollitt coming back in 1950 from his visit to Moscow.
So the basic tenets of the British Road to Socialism, that there are other models than the Soviet model, that Britain will achieve socialism basically through a parliamentary road, they were revealed or told to Pollitt at unpublicised meetings with Stalin or with Stalin's advisors.
Well, I think the general things, as I've already said, had already been accepted before 1950, and apart from looking ahead even earlier than that, in 46 we'd produced a document called Britain for the People, which wasn't a long-term programme, but clearly, because of its references to electoral reform and so on, envisaged the continuation of the parliamentary system. So I think we had abandoned the old model of a Soviet Britain embodied in the 1935 program already before 1950. And what the thing that Stalin did, according to the notes which I have of the discussion, was put in a series of specific formulations which expressed more concretely and in sharper terms trends that had already been developing. And it seems to have been Stalin himself who suggested that the party should have a long-term program, who laid great emphasis on the necessity for this. And so I can't say there would never have been a long-term program if Stalin hadn't pressed it, but there's no evidence that it would have come at that time, certainly. And from the drafts which were produced, even after Stalin's advice was reported, it wouldn't have been the same as what was finally produced, because they were watered down isn't quite the right term, I suppose, but they didn't embody some of the sharpest formulations that Stalin had suggested.
And there was a process whereby Stalin actually saw the drafts. Harry Pollitt went to Berlin. And did he meet Stalin there?
I don't know. Well, I think he went first to Moscow before Berlin. There was a long process of discussion. He came back in June, and then 3 drafts were produced on the basis of what he reported in about 3 weeks. The political committee used to meet every week, and for 3 successive, I think it was 3 successive, the dates are in my article, in 3 successive political committees there was a new draft of the programme. And then there was, I don't know why, there was then a lapse throughout July and August when nothing, I can't find any record of anything apparently happening, and it wasn't until September that the 3rd draft, which had originally been produced at the end of June or the beginning of July, was rediscussed. And then after that, Pollitt went to Moscow, and I don't know whether he saw Stalin or not. My impression is that he probably didn't. I don't know precisely why, but I have the impression that Stalin was probably in the Crimea, or whether, I've forgotten whether his summer residence was at Crimea or the Corps, somewhere in the south anyway, and that probably his views were communicated to Pollitt by other people, or I don't know, maybe even in writing at that time. He obviously, I think, saw the draft because the nature of the comments that were made were specific. You know, it doesn't include this, it doesn't include that, it doesn't include the other among his original suggestions. And so he was obviously pressing for it to do so.
Was the political committee aware of the Soviet role in both the genesis and in the revision of the drafts?
Oh yes, Pollitt reported his discussion with Stalin at the first meeting, and he reported it later on. The interesting thing is that in the Changes article I've reproduced a letter which he sent to Dutt about all this. And of course it didn't say Stalin said this, Stalin said that and the other. It was couched as if it was Pollitt saying it, but it's clear from anybody looking at him who knew Harry and who's read Harry's writings that in fact the language wasn't his. And indeed I was quite clear, he reported at the time that this was the method he chose to put beyond doubt, to have in writing, as it were, what was being advised, and to put it in front of the political committee in that form, but without giving the game away. At least he thought he wasn't giving the game away. If it had been published at the time, I think some people would have had a second thoughts about it. But anyway, that was the form of doing it, that it wouldn't give if it did get into the wrong hands, it wouldn't be immediately obvious that this is Stalin speaking and not Pollitt. So that was the way he did it.
And did the political committee then take a policy decision to keep that knowledge to themselves, or was it simply just the done thing?
Well, I don't remember us ever sitting down and saying, now all this is confidential and, making dire threats to get anybody who revealed it. It may well have been at some point. Possibly early on it was said, well, we must keep this to ourselves, but it was the done thing anyway, and so it wasn't a great issue as to whether my recollection of it is that everybody thought almost instinctively that in the conditions of the time you had to keep this sort of thing limited to a very few people, and that if it got out it would be damaging to the political status of the party in Britain. It would reveal it as a party that was taking its advice from Moscow and so on. So my recollection of it is that we all accepted the necessity to keep it under our hats, and did so, in fact, even from the executive committee, because there's no evidence that the executive committee ever actually was specifically told. Some people might have guessed, and after it was published in full in Pravda and in the Cominform journal, well, anybody who was capable of putting two and two together would know that that implied that it was 100% approved by Stalin, because nothing like that could appear in Pravda or the Cominform journal without Stalin's approval, or without people realizing that it would meet with Stalin's approval, which is a different thing to saying that he inspired it or that he had a big hand in it. I mean, it is conceivable that could have been printed in Pravda without it having been inspired by Stalin. But anyway, by that time, the fact that Stalin was involved to the extent of approving it.
I was telling you that
Where were
we were talking about 1950 and Stalin's, and then discussion within the political committee, and the fact that the executive committee probably wasn't kept fully informed. One thing that Edward Thompson told me, that in 56, in that period between the revelations about the Khrushchev speech and Budapest, he went along to a meeting at which Mick Jenkins let the cat out of the bag and mentioned that Stalin had had a very important role in the drafting of the British Road. What was there any awareness among branch members at that stage that perhaps in their terms something wasn't quite right?
Well, I don't remember myself Stalin's direct involvement having been known to any more than the limited circle of the political committee. Even in 56, what was known, as I've already said, was that he'd approved of it, and some people may well have drawn conclusions from that. And Dutt, for example, this was later on, but in the book he wrote on the International, I think it was called The International, had a passage in which he came as near as damn it to talking about Stalin's role, but not directly. It was in the form of he was combating, I suppose it was the fact that the Chinese were attacking the peaceful coexistence and the parliamentary road and so on, and he was saying that Stalin had approved of the British road, that the international communist movement had approved of it, and Stalin in particular, and so on. So there was that sort of understanding about Stalin's approval, but I don't remember it ever being known beyond the political committee people who were originally involved in the discussions that there'd been a direct input from Stalin. But it's possible, I mean, disciplined and loyal though we all were, it's possible that somebody might have said something about Stalin's role that gave rise to a wider knowledge of it. So that's all I can say about that.
Turning to 56, when did you first hear about the secret speech?
As far as I can remember, it was in dispatches from Sam Russell, the Daily Worker correspondent in Moscow. There may have been other reports appearing in newspapers abroad or even here in Britain, but if I remember rightly, Sam did hear from members of the CPSU what had happened and got a pretty I don't know whether he had a full information about it, but he got quite a lot, and he put over some of that in dispatches to the Daily Worker. So the fact that there had been a secret speech came before the publication of the speech, which in Britain was in the full publication, if I remember rightly, was in the Observer. Was it the end of June, possibly? I should imagine. I mean, it's easy enough to check the dates, which of course was well after the 20th Congress. But in the intervening period, there had been these leaks of bits of it. which had appeared in Britain and elsewhere. I can't recall the exact date or the exact time lapse after the Congress when they first appeared, but it would have been in that period. But at the time, we didn't know about it. I was there with Pollitt and Dutt as the British delegation to the 20th Congress. My assumption is that the speech was made on the day when Pollitt and I were sent to a factory making rubber tyres and other rubber products, which wasn't an unusual thing. I mean, fraternal delegates, as we were called, were, in the case of most continental communist parties, asked to do the odd meeting as well as attend the Congress, and we went to a factory or another town, possibly another town or city. So there was nothing unusual about the fact. They said to Pollitt and myself, we'd like you to go to this factory and Harry can address the workers and so on. That's what happened. What Dutt did that day, I do not know. I don't remember ever hearing what he did that day. But we've assumed since that, and I think that was Harry's assumption also, that was when we heard about the secret speech, that must have been the day we went to the tyre factory. We knew, as everybody else did, from what was publicly said in the Congress itself, that something was up. I mean, Mikoyan said in his speech, we've had no collective leadership for 20 years, which was a pretty clear indication that there had been something wrong. And other things of that kind, but nothing like what was finally said by Khrushchev when he blew the gaff on a lot of it, not all of it. I mean, he came out with a lot more at the subsequent 21st Congress, but there was enough in the 20th Congress to indicate what had happened.
Did you publish Sam Russell's pieces?
As far as I remember, of course this was before I was at the Daily Worker myself, I was still at King Street. As far as I remember, that his dispatches were published. I don't know how fully, to what extent they were subbed in the normal course of journalistic subbing, or whether there was any political censorship. I don't remember now. I mean, it's conceivable that there was some things missed out on the grounds that, well, can this possibly be true, or we mustn't upset people too much at this stage. I simply don't know what. Sam himself could, I'm pretty sure, tell you what was cut out and what wasn't. When the details of the secret speech became known, was there any crisis of confidence in King Street, any air of anxiety? After all, the CP here had been loyally supporting Stalin, and here was Khrushchev pulling the rug from underneath his reputation. Well, it was an enormous shock, and undoubtedly it resulted in I wouldn't say an atmosphere of crisis at King Street, certainly in the initial stages. Subsequently, after Hungary, there became more of something that could really be called a crisis developed, because the combination of the 20th Congress revelations and the events in Hungary did produce a mass exodus from the party, so that after that there was more of a crisis. There were deep divisions in the party after the 20th Congress and before Hungary. I don't want to underplay the extent to which it did result in a lot of people very much questioning previous policies and previous beliefs and previous loyalties. And Edward Thompson will have told you, of course, of the New Reasoner and the Reasoner and all that went with that particular episode. But as far as the party leadership was concerned, I think there was a tendency to underplay the importance of what had happened, to try to put the best possible face on it, and to argue that, well, now they've come clean. It just shows that self-criticism exists in the Soviet party and it's never going to happen again because it's been made. And this sort of attitude which tried to diminish the extent to which people would question previously held beliefs. And Harry got into great trouble on one occasion because he made a speech. I can't remember whether it was in the interregnum between the 20th Congress and Hungary, or whether it was after Hungary, but he made a speech in which he said at one point, well, if the Russians give us a lot of problems, we can always take an aspirin. That wasn't exactly the most sensitive thing to say to people who were deeply worried about what had happened and deeply questioning not only what the Soviet Party had done, but the extent to which the British leadership knew about it and had covered it up, as it were.
And yet the correspondence columns of the Daily Worker remained closed to the dissident voices.
I don't think is that strictly true? I don't think so. I think what happened was there was some discussion, and at one point I seem to remember, this is where you'll need to look up the bound volumes of the Daily Worker to check what I'm saying. I seem to remember the editor, Johnny Campbell, who was then the editor, putting a stop to the discussion at a certain point on the grounds there'd been enough discussion. Well, it was like trying to put the lid on a boiler. I mean, it just didn't work. But I think there was that attempt to quieten it down. It was part of this whole business of not really sufficiently understanding of what had happened, or trying to get to the bottom of it, or draw the right conclusions for the future. I mean, in retrospect, it was wrong. And people like Thompson and John Saville and others who were questioning were absolutely right, and what they did was legitimate in the circumstances at the time. But of course they were in conflict with the leadership. The formal position was they were undoubtedly breaking the rules of the party, and so they were liable to disciplinary action. I mean, some of them got out, like Edward and John, before they were kicked out. If they'd persisted in the party and persisted in what they were doing, I think they would have undoubtedly been expelled from the party. But it was they got out before that happened.
Then Hungary came. What determined the line that the political committee took on Hungary?
Well, this was an occasion on which there was quite a lot of heart-searching, and it wasn't a sort of automatic knee-jerk response to say, well, the Soviet Union's done it and it must therefore be right. As you know, there was a process. Again, I don't recall the details of it now, but the Russians were in Budapest, and then they were out of Budapest, and then they came back. And so it was a fluid situation even there. And the British party leadership took the view that it was a counter-revolution. We read all these stories, not only in the communist press, but in some of the bourgeois press, about people being hanged from lampposts and so on. The fact that some of them were members of the secret police and may well have, in a sense, deserved what happened to them, it wasn't a factor in our mind. We took the view these are communists, they're being hanged from lampposts. It wasn't quite as simple as that, but basically we took the view it was a counter-revolution, and therefore socialism was in danger, and therefore you could justify what the Soviet Union did on that basis. As I say, I don't think it was a conclusion that was come to very easily. I remember a meeting, it was a meeting of the Executive Committee just at the time of the Soviet action in Budapest, when we were going to discuss the line to be taken. And Gollin and Pollitt and I were in Gollin's room, because Gollin was by then the General Secretary, at King Street, waiting for the rest of the people to come to the meeting down in the hall there. And I remember Harry saying, well, you youngsters will have to decide what you're going to do. I'm too old to change, which the implication of which was that even after the 56, 20th Congress, he was still very much in that position. The Russians, if the Russians do it, they must have good reasons, and so on. I don't remember the nuts and bolts of it, but I think both Johnny and I had doubts, but we did in the end come down to the view that it was a counter-revolution and argued for that, and the Executive Committee took that position and produced a relatively brief statement on that day. I forgot the date. It was a Sunday. It was the date of the big anti-Suez, because it coincided with Suez, a big anti-Suez demonstration in Trafalgar Square, I think. And we produced a short statement from the Executive Committee, which did, in a sense, poured fuel on the flames, because it was so short and because it was so unqualified, and it didn't really probe into the reasons why, even if you accepted that it had happened, why it had happened. And so that really, I think, exacerbated rather than placated people who had doubts, but who might have possibly stuck in if a different treatment of it had occurred at the time.
Was there anybody on the political committee arguing against the line that you took?
I don't think so. I mean, there may well have been doubts expressed, but I don't recall anybody specifically arguing against the line that we took. And in the Executive Committee, I really don't remember sufficiently well to say. I think there have been people since. I'm not sure that Brian Behan, I think he was on the Executive Committee at the time, and I think subsequently he has claimed to have been opposed to the position that we took. But I don't know whether he's putting the best face on it from his point of view, or whether it may well have been so. I just don't remember. Certainly there wasn't anything like a big revolt against it, and I'm not even sure that there may be a record, although I don't think there is, of the vote that was actually taken. It might even have been a unanimous vote. I mean, it might have been that people expressed doubts but didn't carry it to the extent of formal opposition.
Then there was the incident in which Peter Fryer's dispatches from Budapest were not carried by the Daily Worker. What was the justification for that?
Well, again, that's a bit of an exaggeration, because I think two of them were carried more or less in full. Again, you must check on this. I think it's perfectly reasonable to accept Peter Fryer's own version of it anyway in his book. But if I remember rightly, a couple were published, and the final one, I think Peter says that who by that time I'd been sent to the Daily Worker on a temporary basis, because the editor, Johnny Campbell, was in Moscow and Mick Bennett was the assistant editor, and it was felt that he could do with a bit of help, so I was sent there. And Peter says in his book, I think, that I drastically censored what I suppose must have been his final dispatch, which may well be the case. I mean, every journalist, as you know, complains about subs, says that subs have cut out the best bits and so on, but I think it may well be that I went beyond the normal call of duty in subbing it. I don't remember now. I mean, I would actually be quite interested I don't know whether Peter's still got the full text of what he sent. I'd be quite interested to compare it with what actually appeared, but I'm quite prepared to believe that it was censored to some extent. Well, you can't justify it now. I mean, at the time, one rationalised it and justified it to oneself in the sense that it was against the policy of the party, that it was giving what we regarded as a false picture, and we shouldn't mislead the readers. They could get all this stuff in other papers. Why use up space in the Daily Worker with this sort of stuff? You know, one could rationalise it on those grounds. In retrospect, of course, we shouldn't have done it. We should have published what Peter sent. And I've apologised to Peter since then publicly at this event that we had not so long ago on the Communist Party in Moscow for what happened at that time. mind you, I think Peter himself went a bit too far the other way. I mean, I think there were, as was probably inevitable, counter-revolutionary elements as well as genuine democratic opposition to what had happened and what was happening, and they were mixed up. And I think we saw virtually only the counter-revolutionary aspects. Peter saw only the democratic aspect. I think he was more right than we were, but I think he did overdo it a bit in that respect and pay too little attention to the danger that existed to socialism.
So the party came out of 56 having lost, about a third of its membership?
Well, was it as much as that? I don't think it was quite as much as that. If I remember rightly, we lost 7,000 or 8,000. And we probably had something over 30,000, I should think 35. But anyway, it was a very substantial number, a quarter, you could say, I should think.
And there was an attempt to at least meet some of the grievances of the circle associated with the Reason, with the Commission on Inter-Party Democracy, which then reported the following year in terms which was at least seen as endorsing democratic centralism. In other words, there was still an unwillingness to change.
Well, certainly on democratic centralism, it wasn't just seen as democratic. I mean, it specifically defended democratic centralism. Now, I'm not even sure that the people who were opposed to the leadership ever launched a frontal attack on democratic centralism. Possibly, I don't remember it. I mean, my impression is that what they argued was for amending it, for liberalizing it, as it were, for introducing more aspects into it of a democratic character, and for exercising it with less rigidity. And whereas on the other side, the sort of hardline position was, well, if you do all these things, you in effect destroy it from within, as it were, and so we've got to justify it. So the majority report from that commission was a total justification of democratic centralism. So it certainly didn't have the effect, I think, of winning over people who had great qualms about what was happening at the time.
And we now know in 58 Moscow resumed funding of the party through John Gollan and Reuben Folber. Were you aware of that?
Well, I wasn't aware of it at that time. By the way, you say resumed funding. Well, I don't know whether or when it had stopped. I mean, it might have existed before 58. I just don't know. The only thing I know of goes back a long way before that, namely to 1925, when the raid on the King Street took place and all the documents were published in a blue book, and including the correspondence with Moscow about the funding. There's some rather amusing things in that, like the carbon copy of the British letter to Moscow complaining about the lack of vigilance on the part of Moscow and lack of attention to security. Well, to keep a carbon copy of a letter complaining that they weren't observing the niceties is a bit much. But anyway, that's the only previous thing I know of. By the way, another thing which you may not be aware of, because I don't think it's ever been published, we've got here a document which Dutt did, I think in 1970 anyway, it's quite late on, about relations with the Comintern in the early period of the party's history. And in the course of it, he says that in 1923 he was sent to Moscow to take part in a commission on the British Party. The Comintern had a habit of setting up commissions on the British Party now and again. And he made 3 propositions at this commission. One was that Pollitt, this was 23, one was that Pollitt should be General Secretary. Second, that all financial funding, what he called international financial support for the British Party should be ended on the grounds that it was an unhealthy thing and that it meant that that he felt that small parties should stand on their own feet. And his third related to the trade unions, and in essence, I think, was in opposition to the idea of setting up rival trade unions to the official ones. And he says in this memorandum, done many years later, that all these things were they were all rejected by the Commission, all three of his propositions, but they all subsequently were accepted. So I think it's. I mean, you could always have to take what Dutch says with a pinch of salt, in the sense that he's always anxious to prove that he was right in whatever he'd done. But he may well have been. I mean, this may well have been the case, and I think he probably genuinely did think that it had all stopped later on, and maybe it had. I think probably during the war it did, because I imagine there were practical problems at that time anyway about it. But whether it was a resumption in 58 after a long period of nothing, I really don't know, and I don't think Reuben Felber knows either. He was just confronted with it at that time. Well, I got a bit away from your question by wandering off.
When did you know about the resumption or the payment?
I really find it very difficult to remember. I mean, I did know about it when I was editor of the Daily. I knew the Daily Worker was getting money, but at what point I don't know, because for the most part I wasn't directly involved. I didn't handle the money, as it were. As Reuben Felber says, it was all done through David Ainley, who was the secretary of the People's Press Printing Society. And so he handled it all. There may have been two occasions on which Reuben actually came to me with money, but that would have been quite late on. I would have thought probably the late 60s, and I thought it all stopped because, as Reuben says, I think if I can remember rightly, in 72. They cut back. They reduced the Soviet subsidy, or whatever you like to call it. So I think from that time on, none came to the Daily Worker, or as it would have been by then, the Morning Star. And I thought it had all stopped then. I mean, I was surprised when Reuben revealed that it continued after that period, because I thought Johnny Golland had put a stop to it, and I thought that was a good thing. But anyway, they did agree to continue it on a reduced scale, apparently, according to Reuben, who I believe it. I mean, I accept absolutely what he says about that. So I don't remember when I first knew about it, but I was aware that money was coming to the Daily Worker.
And on the couple of occasions that Reuben Felber brought the money direct to you, this was, a plastic bag full of used fivers?
I think it was a briefcase, if I remember rightly, not a plastic bag. Certainly, I suppose I don't know that I ever looked very closely at the actual contents. I just accepted what Reuben said about it, and I don't remember what I did with it actually. I mean, whether he came to see me because David wasn't available and I just handed it over to David, I just don't remember. I remember a safe deposit came into it at some point. It was deposited in a safe deposit, but I can't remember what happened to it after that.
Of course, a group that would have known about the money right from the start would be the British Security Services, because they took considerable pains both to infiltrate and to bug the party headquarters. How much aware were you of the interest that MI5 was taking when you were working in King Street and in the Daily Worker?
Well, by the way, first of all, I'm not sure they did know about it. I mean, they suspected it, but as Reuben says in his piece, Peter Wright has an account of an effort on their part to put an agent into his house, and which didn't come off. So I think how hard their information was, I don't know. or to what extent they suspected but weren't able to prove what was going on. Well, we were always, you operated on the assumption that everything you said, certainly on the phone, was being listened to. You assumed that if they could bug a place, they would. I think there were, although I wasn't directly involved in it, there were one or two occasions when security-friendly people who knew about these things, bugging devices and so on, did do investigations to see whether they could find any in King Street. But it wasn't until 1975, I believe, that we had absolute proof that this was happening when the builders came in to make some alterations to the conference room at King Street and discovered a bugging device, which I've still got, by the way, which was a quite bulky in bugging terms. I mean, I suppose it's the size of a Walkman, today's Walkman, but not a tiny little bug. And that was concealed in the platform, the wooden platform behind which the chairman and opener of discussions and so on used to sit. We'd suspected something before that, because on one occasion I was in the entrance hall during an executive committee meeting in the lunch break, and the caretaker at that time had his radio on, and he was sort of swiveling the dial around, and suddenly we heard coming over his radio what was being said inside the hall by the members of the executive committee who was still in there. So we knew something was up. But the proof, as I say, didn't come till 1975 when